By now, Hyams was married to David Picker, who was running Paramount Pictures. Paramount had signed a deal with the French director Louis Malle, who to that point had already been nominated for 2 Oscars and had just arrived in the U.S., eager to make movies about his new home. Picker suggested Malle and Polly work together, and after Malle read the switcheroo script, the pair began meeting regularly.
I would come to his sumptuous office with pâté, French bread, and a good bottle of Bordeaux, and we would spend hours talking. I began to ask him what about America besides our films did he like. He liked American jazz, he told me, the music that came out of New Orleans during the days prior to World War I. I had a book of photographs of prostitutes taken by a man named E.J. Belloc, which had haunted me for a number of years. These women were from Storyville, the district designated legal for prostitution in New Orleans during the early 1900s, and where that kind of jazz was born. The expressions on the faces of these prostitutes were arresting. There was a trust in the eyes of these women. They looked relaxed and comfortable with this photographer who took their pictures in the daylight when they were not working. Some were dressed in Sunday finery, others were naked except for their shoes. I wanted to know more about them and the man who took their pictures. I pulled the book out and showed Malle the pictures and told him I would be able to write about these characters. He could have his music.
Polly thought back to a location scout for the last picture show, for a scene that was in the novel but not ultimately filmed, set in a bordello town in Mexico. When Polly had gone to a real such town with Peter and Larry McMurtry, she had been surprised to see that the streets were full of playing children.
I conceived the idea that the story should be about the daughter of a prostitute, a young girl like my daughter, Antonia, a spirited and know-it-all child who would basically have nothing but boredom where her mother's occupation was concerned. Then we could reveal the downstairs whorehouse from the point of view of this young girl.
Antonia was just 9 or 10 when Polly had this idea, and she was, clearly, not the daughter of a sex worker. But today, she sees a lot of herself in her mother's script.
I was watching Pretty Baby, and I was trying not to be egotistical about it, but I was like, this character is exactly me. There were all these physical things she was doing as a character that I used to do, and I was like, oh, my mom just took, which is, as a writer too, I saw. So yeah, I mean, and then the kind of provocativeness of a young girl. Even though I wasn't having sex young, I was flirtatious without knowing it. So all those things, and innocent, but way ahead of my age in terms of experience, which Brooke Shields' character grows up in a whorehouse, so she has that. I think that was mimicking a lot of what I was seeing in Hollywood growing up in that industry. So I cried at the end because it was almost like she was talking to me from the grave, saying, I love you.
Polly's goal had been to work at home in Los Angeles, but Pretty Baby, pretty frequently, took her pretty far from home. She went to New Orleans, where she found oral histories of jazz musicians, learned about the family history of photographer E.J. Belloc, and discovered that during the time in which her film was going to be set, a girl as young as 12 could legally marry without her parents' consent. When it was time to actually do the writing, Polly repaired to a ranch house she had bought in the Arizona desert. After filming A Star Is Born there.
There were great thunderstorms out there in that desert, and I lived alone, went for walks in the beautiful desert with my dog Buster, a bull mastiff. I started drinking around lunchtime, after I'd corrected the previous day's writing, and drank and wrote all afternoon. My mind was gone by 5 o'clock, just in time to enjoy the sunset and watch television. I made my dinner and went to bed to rise with the sun and start all over again. I was spending so much time there that I brought the children out from California and enrolled them in the one-room schoolhouse at Elgin, and they loved it. I had achieved my goal, to be with my children so I would be there when they came home from school, but the damage was already done. They didn't seem happy to have me around. They had learned to fend for themselves. Besides, I was drinking excessively, starting at lunch and still unaware that I was an alcoholic. Alcoholics are not consistent. They are not reliable. They are quick to anger for little or no reason. They are like a tornado whirling through the lives of their families. I was not helping my children, but I didn't know it yet. You would think I would, since both my mother and father, dead from alcoholism, were not there for me when I was a child. But I couldn't imagine life without alcohol.
While writing Pretty Baby, Polly was thinking like a production designer and also a producer. As she told a seminar at the American Film Institute,
I wrote the movie to be cheap. I wrote it all in one set, essentially, even though there are 4 or 5 other small locations.
Polly would get her first producer's credit on Pretty Baby, but as was now common for her, on this film she was more integral to the production than a person with screenwriter and associate producer credits usually would be. And yet, she'd soon learn she didn't have the leeway she'd had as an unofficial producer on Peter's films. Polly had a gift for casting, and she thought the part of the photographer in Pretty Baby should go to Jack Nicholson. In the mid-70s, Nicholson was considered both a box office draw and one of the best actors in the world. He had just won his first Oscar for One Flew Over the Cuckoo's Nest, which had been a massive hit. Jack would have been a pretty big get for a relatively small film like Pretty Baby, or at least Polly thought so. Without consulting with the movie's director, Polly got her script to Nicholson by going through executive David Picker. Jack read it and loved it, and Picker called Polly to tell her that the biggest star who could possibly play this part wanted to do it.
I was thrilled and ran to Louis with the good news. Louis was furious. He told me he did not want to work with a movie star in his first movie in Hollywood. Stars were difficult. Louis felt betrayed that I had not consulted him about Jack. I was completely astonished and kept telling him that Jack was not difficult at all, that he, Louis, had lost his mind. Louis was adamant and I was furious. It was the end of our friendship. I was used to being respected and listened to about such things. I knew that if it were Peter directing, I would not be having this problem. My heart was broken, and I felt we had blown the movie. Nevertheless, we went forward with a real rift between Louis and me.
Louis Malle's reasons for not wanting to cast Jack Nicholson may have been valid, but in hindsight, it also looks like he was reacting to his female screenwriter and producer taking an initiative without asking his opinion or permission. In our last episode, Polly described all male directors as being arrogant and spoiled. This may have not been entirely true of all men, but it does seem like several of the men Polly worked with expected her to be something like a housewife, coddling and considerate of their feelings, quietly doing all the work to make the man's life easier, and to bring his vision of the film to life without argument. Louis Malle was different from a lot of directors Polly had worked with to that point. He had seemed to want a real creative collaboration with her, but at the end of the day, he also wanted her to be deferential to him, and as a result, they butted heads. Instead of Jack Nicholson, the part went to Keith Carradine, who Polly dismissed as soft, effete, wrong for the role, and not a very interesting actor, in my opinion. I do think Carradine is an interesting actor, but I generally agree that Jack Nicholson would have been more interesting in this role. Nicholson was considered one of Hollywood's most masculine men in the late 1970s, and he would have brought a real sexual threat to the part that Carradine did not. However, what Carradine did bring was ambiguity. Polly calls him effete as a pejorative, but the relationship between the adult man and child is effectively unsettling throughout Pretty Baby because it's so unclear to what extent he's motivated by sexual attraction. If Nicholson had played that part because he was so beloved as a star and so idolized as a man of the 70s, the relationship between him and a child might have seemed more romantic. With Carradine in the part, it's strange and sad. A brief sidebar. On March 10th, 1977, while Pretty Baby was shooting in New Orleans, 42-year-old Roman Polanski took a 13-year-old girl to Jack Nicholson's Mulholland Drive house, gave her a quaalude, and raped her. If Nicholson had been shooting Pretty Baby at the time, a film about men in their 40s and older having sex with a 12-year-old girl who appears to be way too young to consent, one wonders how the discourse would have been different. For Polanski, for Nicholson, and for Pretty Baby. Because while for decades we've heard that the 70s were a quote-unquote different time in which sex between adult men and young girls was normalized, there are different ways people of the 70s chose to respond to this normalization. Obviously, some men capitalized on it to feed their sexual desires and to sell imagery of the fetishization of girls and teens. But while Pretty Baby was called child pornography by some critics in the late 70s, watching it today, it is absolutely clear that Louis Malle and Polly Platt were not romanticizing statutory rape. If anything, by showing how a 12-year-old girl's body is put up for sale and then rescued by a savior who indulges in a murkier transactional relationship with her, the filmmakers use a historical microcosm to critique a then-present-day culture in which youthful sexuality was fetishized to an absurd and dangerous degree. I asked Antonia if she felt Polly had infused Pretty Baby with a critique of 70s Hollywood.
For sure, because she talked a lot about that with different men in Hollywood, but that was always, not in public, but we all know about that, and we knew about it then, and I think she was kind of disgusted with it.
Yeah.
What do they see in those young girls? Like, why aren't they interested in women, What is this thing? That's really interesting.
Of course, it's impossible to imagine this film being made in this same way today, with full frontal imagery of a naked 12-year-old girl in the context of a story about that girl trading on her sexuality. Back then, many questioned what kind of mother would let their daughter play such a role. Polly found the actress who would anchor Pretty Baby in a book of photographs by Francisco Scavullo. Scavullo was a top photographer of the 1970s, responsible for Cosmopolitan magazine's infamous naked centerfold of Burt Reynolds, and for the image of Christopherson and Streisand that formed the basis of the A Star Is Born poster. In 1966, Scavullo had shot images of a baby model for an Ivory Soap ad. A decade later, Scavullo included a topless photo of the same model, now 10 years old, in his book, Scavullo on Beauty. This model was Brooke Shields, and though she had been working steadily since that Ivory Soap ad when she was 11 months old, she was not yet a household name. When Polly saw Scavullo's photo of a naked, prepubescent Brooke Shields, Polly thought,
she was the most beautiful girl I'd ever seen. When I wrote the screenplay, I'd not imagined such a beauty in the part. But when I saw the photo, I began to rethink the concept. I showed the photo to Louis, and he was interested too. We flew to New York to meet Brooke, who arrived with her mother, Terry. Louis and I were hopeful that Brooke could act, and she could indeed. Little did we know at the time that Brooke's life was very troubled because of her alcoholic, volatile, and very unstable mother.
Brooke Shields has written a whole memoir about her complicated relationship with her mother. Terry took Brooke to bars when she was a baby, and then later left her daughter with virtual strangers when she'd go out to drink. Around 3rd grade, Brooke began to realize that her mom was drunk every afternoon when she came home from school. Brooke's stories are similar to those told by Tatum O'Neal about her own mother in her memoir, a paper life, with the crucial exception that Tatum's mother truly failed to parent her children. Though Brooke, as she wrote, felt abandoned by her when she drank, Terry remained physically present in a way that Tatum's mother, Joanna, did not. Still, abandonment of daughters by mothers was the major theme here. Polly had felt abandoned by her mother. She worried her own daughters felt abandoned by her, and she wrote all of that into Pretty Baby. Then, when it came time for Terry, Brooke, Polly, and the rest of the Pretty Baby crew to shoot on location in New Orleans, part of Polly's job became to separate the film's star from her mother. Polly's writing on the shooting of Pretty Baby is heavily colored by her frustration over having to intervene to keep Brooke away from Terry, who Polly is extremely critical of. Probably in part because she reminded Polly of the parts of herself Polly most abhorred. Not all of Polly's memories mesh with Brooke's memories, but by Brooke's admission, though she liked having her mom on location with her, she didn't want Terry to watch her act. Polly tells one story of a morning in which Brooke asked her to keep an eye on a drunk Terry while Brooke was shooting.
We were shooting in a residential area of New Orleans, and it was only about 11 a.m., but Terry Shields somehow found a bar. She walked across the street, nearly being run over by a huge Budweiser beer truck. The driver was so enraged that he got out of the truck and accosted Terry, bawling her out as I watched. Terry put her arm through his and encouraged him to go into the bar with her, which he did. I peered in the window and watched the two of them find a place at the bar. I followed them inside. I sat down next to her. I was so alcoholic that I could have just as easily ordered a beer myself, but somehow it didn't occur to me.
According to Polly, this afternoon ended with Polly in the emergency room after a belligerent Terry bit her, breaking the skin. At some point during the shoot, Terry got into a car accident. Brooke Shields and Polly Platt tell different stories about this accident in their different memoirs. Polly claimed that Terry, in violation of union regulations, insisted on driving her daughter to set every day, and one day, Terry was speeding with Brooke in the car, lost control of the vehicle, crashed, and when a policeman came on the scene, Terry slapped him and was thrown in jail. Polly claimed she refused to bail Terry out of jail. As she wrote, with unacknowledged irony about her own life,
somewhere along the line I had learned that alcoholics need to face the consequences of their drunkenness. Brooke seemed to understand this. She almost welcomed it. Brooke went to work like the pro that she was.
In Brooke's version of the story, she wasn't in the car with her mother, and though she suspected her mother was drunk at the time of the crash, she also implied that the Teamsters had disabled the brakes in Terry's car in retaliation after Terry complained about the long hours Brooke was working. Brooke also accused Polly and especially Tony Wade, who was the unit production manager on Pretty Baby, of bullying and intimidating the child actress to keep the shoot on schedule. The story told in a New York Magazine story about Brooke, published in September 1977 before the movie was released, hewed a bit closer to Polly's account. According to Polly, after she saw Brooke's mom kick in a TV in their shared hotel room on one occasion and slap her daughter on another, Polly was able to convince Terry to go someplace to dry out and leave the production in peace for a few weeks. In the New York Magazine story, Terry claims she was kicked off set. She also jokes about her 12-year-old daughter's breasts, which she refers to alternately as her, quote, little titties and, quote, little knobs. In that same story, when asked to defend the sexual material Brooke performed in the film, Polly was quoted as saying,
I was more worried about Brooke's family problems than the sex scenes.
Obviously, this is all very thorny stuff. made more so by the fact that Polly was also an alcoholic, and that while Polly was separating Brooke from her mother, Polly's own daughters were back in Los Angeles without their mother. This whole film had started out of Polly's desire to repair her relationship with Sashi and Antonia by being more present in their lives. But now she was 2,000 miles away from them and spending her days looking after another alcoholic mother's daughter.